Hello everybody, so I thought I'd do another video for you now just from a different location from in my bedroom. I thought I'd do a little video now all about climate change, global warming, etc. and why I don't really think that climate change is happening, and just from a very kind of a superficial level of evidence. I think that if you look outside, if you look at the snow outside, you see, yeah, it's snowing outside just like it seems to do every year. Every year we seem to get a little bit of snow, and that much never changes. I don't really remember it being much warmer this year. Actually, I do remember it being warmer this year. I mean, the weather up until Christmas or so was really quite mild, and I was beginning to think, yeah, kind of maybe there is a little bit of global warming going on here, since the weather's quite mild, but now it's cooled down again drastically, and there's snow about, and do I really remember it being warmer or colder than it has been every single year of my life up until this point? Not really. I mean, we've had colder years than this, I think, but it's pretty cold out there at the moment. Last year was very wet this time of year, this kind of January, February sort of time. Yeah, I don't really think that there is much climate change going on at all. I think that the weather seems to be pretty consistent. Or is it just that I've grown up in an epoch of climate change, so I don't know any better? I don't know. I mean, they say that the winters many years ago were much colder than the winters are now, but I don't really see that. I don't. I have to say, I think with weather, every now and then you get kind of exceptionally cold bits of weather, you get exceptionally hot bits of weather. There's just anomalies. There's just the compounding of anomalous bits of weather here, there, and everywhere, and that's really what's going on in climate science. And you've got this kind of 1.5 degrees of warming that they think is happening, but I think what's really going on is that's the compounding of anomalies in the data, and you get an error bar of about 1.5 degrees in the climate statistics, and it's just this propagation of error through different climate models. And there's research that's been put out by I think it was the National Accelerator Laboratory or something in the United States. Some scientists working for the National Accelerator Laboratory in a physics paper pointed this out. But it could just be the compounding of error, the compounding of anomaly in data that leads to this impression that the world is getting warmer. And from the physics perspective of climate change, I still don't agree with it. I still don't. I still think that CO2 molecules in the atmosphere must be reflecting infrared light coming from the sun back into space. So we got all this infrared radiation. 51 or 52% of the sun's radiation comes to us from the infrared, and that's getting reflected. That will be getting reflected by CO2 in the atmosphere, and none of that has never been taken into account in the research. It's never been entertained because all this climate science stuff started in the 1980s when they were convinced that the majority of sunlight comes to us in the form of visible light, but the visible light hits the surface of the earth, um, shifts to the infrared part of the spectrum, then the infrared goes up into the atmosphere to then be reflected from the atmosphere back down towards the surface by CO2 molecules. Like that's the greenhouse effect. And I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that bit of science. I don't see any problem with that. However, you've got to acknowledge that by exactly the same logic, if there's all this infrared coming from the sun, which there is, and there will be a little bit of infrared coming from the sun in the 15 nanometer range or the 15 micrometer range, which is the range reflected mostly by CO2, although it reflects at other wavelengths as well. Um, you've got to acknowledge that that'll be getting reflected back into space by the CO2 in the atmosphere. It must be. So, by precisely the same logic that there's a greenhouse effect, there must be a reverse greenhouse effect also. Yet no one's published on this. And if I were to write a paper on it now, it would never get published just because the deadlock in the climate science argument is so extreme, and there's so much suppression of freedom of speech going around, and so much shadow banning, and so many campaigns against so-called misinformation and disinformation, and all these sorts of things that go around, that I'd get shouted down, I'd never get published. Yes, a majority of scientists have formed a sort of consensus on this issue, where they're very, very, very sure that climate change is happening due to human emissions. Right. So the lone voices on the fringes of science and from within the scientific community itself, since there isn't a complete consensus. It's about 97% of scientists who believe this stuff, and there's 3% of outlying cases in science. And these outliers are people like John Clauser, the Nobel laureate, um, Patrick Moore, the former head of Greenpeace, and the late Freeman Dyson, who's a phenomenal scientist, brilliant mind, Wolf Prize recipient of the Wolf Prize, which is very often thought to be a precursor to a Nobel Prize. So, very, very highly esteemed people question the climate science arguments and really interrogate the data. And, because you've got 97% of scientists on your side, does not mean you're correct. No, it does not. That's the bandwagoning fallacy for you. That's or it's the appeal to authority fallacy. That does not mean that your argument is correct just because there's 97% of people in agreement with it. Not at all. It could very well be the case that these outliers, those are correct, and that you're not correct, and that you've got to revise your models somewhat. But fundamentally, looking at the physics of it, I don't see that it's happening. I look at the weather outside also, and I don't see it happening. I don't see it being 1.5 degrees warmer now. I don't see, and I know they changed it from global warming to climate change because the climate is apparently changing, but it's not necessarily getting warmer anymore. But then I don't understand like where their points of consternation lie if it's not getting warmer now. Is there just more extreme weather or something like this? Is that the argument? And really, I don't know if there is more extreme weather, and I don't think we've been measuring weather long enough to be able to delineate whether or not there truly is more extreme weather now than there has been in the past. Um, are hurricanes, tornadoes, and wildfires becoming more uh, frequent? I don't. Are they? I don't think so. I think the hottest temperature ever recorded on Earth was recorded in is it? I think the aptly named Furnace Valley in the United States in California, back in the 1920s. So what does that tell you? I mean, it's not getting warmer, for goodness sake. It's not getting warmer for the reasons that I've mentioned, because CO2 also reflects radiation. It reflects infrared radiation coming from the sun. And then I hear other things like adiabatic processes going on in the upper atmosphere or in the stratosphere. And I said, that is sophistry, I'm sorry to say. You're just coming up, you you add layers of sophistry, there's casuistry, there's no other real way to put it, into these scientific debates to try and make yourself seem cleverer than other people, or that other people haven't fully understood the physics and the science of it. Whereas I think people who have understood how bullshitty the climate science debate is have understood the science well enough. I think John Clauser, the Nobel Prize fucking winner, has understood the science well enough, as has the scientist ecologist Patrick Moore, and so did Freeman Dyson, the esteemed mathematician and physicist. Um, I don't think these people had a slipshod understanding of the science in any real regard, and I think that their points are eminently worthy of being taken seriously, most certainly. And there is an open debate in science, and there ought to be one. about this issue, even if it's a minority within the scientific community holding opinions contrary to the majority, it should still be entertained. It should still be considered an active area of research, and it is an active area of research, and there's very good cases to be made, yeah, against the climate science argument. Now, this video is coming up to 10 minutes, and I think I've roughly said all I want to say. But yeah, it's a shame that it goes to these places. It's a shame that we get to this point where we have people like the Centre for Combating Digital Hate actively trying to shut people down on the internet and trying to suppress people, basically, and suppress differing opinions and suppress opinions that are contrary to what the majority doggedly and dogmatically believe. And I'm afraid to say, I think there's a very compelling case to be made against climate change that hasn't been made, and it comes down to this reverse greenhouse effect, and it comes down to the fact that CO2 will be reflecting incoming infrared radiation from the sun, that we need to move past this 1980s paradigm wherein we believe that almost all solar radiation was visible light. We need to update our thinking, update our models, and undertake climate modeling and the statistical analysis of climate modeling to to a more sophisticated level. We need to take it to a more sophisticated place and update it in light of what we know now, and stop this doom mongering and stop this doom prophesying. I mean, we can't predict what the weather's going to be like really in 2 weeks' time. We can get a few days ahead of the weather, can't we? We can predict we can predict what it's like we're going to be like in 2 weeks' time, I think, but not really much further than that. We can't really go to like a month in the future and say what's going to happen, which is a bit shambolic if you think about it. So, I mean, how can we predict what's going to happen with climate change then? If we can't predict the weather more than 2 weeks in advance, how do you know it's going to be a scorched and barren plain from having released a bit of carbon dioxide? It just isn't going to happen. So there is going to be no end of the world scenario as a result of climate fucking change, since, well, all sorts of reasons. CO2 is not causing the planet to heat up. It just isn't. It just is not. It's not. It's not. For the reasons I've outlined, for the reasons I've stated. Thank you everyone for watching. I'll leave it at this, I think, and say very goodbye to you. Thanks for watching. See you soon.